So welcome to this next part of the webinar series that Mission Karmayogi has launched. The Capacity Building Commission and the Karmayogi Bharat together has been planning this year-long webinar series with different topics to enhance the quality of learning and to expand the horizons of all our civil servants. Today's webinar is also very special. You might all be remembering that we had topics related to the Indian knowledge systems as part of the National Learning Week. And we will be bringing to you also different topics from the space every month so that we are all able to learn from the civilizational wisdom of Bharat. Now, today's webinar is going to be conducted by a very special person who's very popular for two of his books. One is Kautilyanomics for modern times and his latest book, which is called Dharmanomics. And he'll be bringing concepts from all these books. And it's Sriram Balasubramanian, who's a very well-known economist and a best-selling author, and he's been at one of the world's leading international monetary institutions. He's also worked in the IMF in the past, and apart from writing and authoring such best-selling books and articles, he's also known for his understanding of and expertise in global macroeconomics, socioeconomic trends in emerging markets, and more importantly, what is very critical for us as we are in Amritkal working towards a Vikasit Bharat, about how do you integrate appreciation of the Dharmic our culture, the Indic culture, in the context of economics. Now, economics might seem like a very intensely quantitative world, and it might seem very dry and bereft of a cultural appreciation of it. But Sriram very wonderfully combines this, and several of you may want to buy and read his book and brings it out, and I'm sure today's presentation will be something which all of us will enjoy. Now, he's an alumnus of the Columbia University, New York, and I will not take much of your time, and I'll now hand it over to Sriram Balasubramanian to help us understand what does he mean by Dharmanomics, how is it relevant to the world of public policy, and how is it culturally appropriate for a nation like India, and how this could be a very, very powerful foundation as we march towards Vikasit Bharat. Thank you so much, Sriram, for joining us, and it's been a pleasure that you're able to join us. I know it's you live in a different part of the world in Washington, D.C., and we are here in Delhi. And I welcome you to this webinar series, and I'm looking forward to listening to you and understanding how we could all benefit from your wisdom in this space.
Namaste. Thank you, Dr. Balu, for your kind introduction, and very kind words. And I'm glad to be part of this wonderful event. Mission Karmayogi is something I've read a lot about, and the entire work done in the Prime Minister's office in regards to this is not just impressive, it also provides an inspiration for a lot of researchers who are trying to enhance the quality and enhance the understanding of a lot of these issues, especially in our progress towards Viksit Bharat. So I'm glad to be part of this. And of course, with Dr. Balu and his excellent work and his wonderful book, I think it also provides a very good springboard for thought leaders such as myself to present some of my work. So I'm very grateful and glad to be part of this discussion. So I'll briefly run through this presentation. The title of it is, Policymaking and Importance of Cultural Norms and Narratives, Dharma-Based Economic Frameworks and Their Relevance. Just to give you a quick brief background about what this presentation is going to be. One major area that I'll deal with is what is this Dharmic way of life that I'm talking about? Why is it important to understand its importance from a policy sense? What are some of the research questions that I deal with? Because a lot of my research deals with, over the last decade, deals with some key research questions which are relevant today that led me to work on some of my books. And what are some of the examples in the past and the present? And of course, what's the way forward for policymakers, for thought leaders, and people dealing with policy at the ground level? What are some of the things that we could take forward from some of these ideas? Why is it important to understand it from a policy sense? I think the first important thought is that cultural norms and narratives play a very important role in our economic choices, corporate decisions, and drive economic activities. I think compared to a lot of other countries where the role of culture is important, in a lot of individual choices. In Bharat, this becomes much more profound. A lot of our individual discretionary spending, where we invest a lot of time in terms of our non-essential spending, is all linked to a lot of our cultural choices and our cultural way of life. And this is just not during a particular time, but throughout the year. And this is at the individual level. And of course, corporate level as well, a lot of decisions are intertwined, and they also drive economic activities. And this is a product of thousands of years of lived experience, and which generally supersedes any policies which are sort of anathema to it, because this way of life has been a natural sort of way of life. As I mentioned, individual economic decisions are highly driven by this dharmic way of life. An example is, for example, in the last year, the highest number of UPI transactions was the week before during Diwali. So that was the time where the most number of UPI transactions took place during last year. So this is an example where a cultural event such as Diwali triggers a lot of economic activity, and that economic activity is seen how people make consumer choices. Similarly, at the corporate level, if you really notice, most of the top business firms in the country are all family-driven firms, and most of them, even though they're publicly listed, a lot of them have family-driven entities, and they make business choices based on the cultural cycle of the country. And that's an important point that we need to be cognizant of. An example is when Mukesh Ambani and Jensen Huang were having an interaction in Mumbai recently, where Mr. Ambani was talking about the role of Diwali and role of importance of cultural events in a lot of their business choices. And I think these are examples that you see even in the corporate sector. Similarly, in the informal sector, which drives about 75 to 80% of employment even today in Bharat, a lot of the architecture of governance, of business governance in the informal sector, in a lot of these small and medium enterprises, is based on cultural norms such as trust, familial and community-driven connections. So these norms and narratives play a very important role in both the financing as well as the governance of a lot of these small and medium-based institutions. So in this sense, these are all some of the ways in which this dharmic way of life plays an important role in driving economic choices. Is this an India-centric event or India-centric phenomena? Not really. I mean, most countries have such cultural norms which drive a lot of their choices. In the West, for example, though this is limited compared to Bharat, there's a lot of research that's been done on the role of norms and narratives in economic choices and decision making. George Akerlof, for example, who was a Nobel Prize winner in 2002 for asymmetric information, he has done a lot of work on identity economics, the role of identity, norms, and narratives in Western societies on how they drive economic choices. Similarly, Abner Grieve from Stanford, Gary Becker from University of Chicago in the 1960s have again done research on the role of economic history, the role of economic culture in economic choices. This is just in the West. If you look at the Chinese, the Japanese, even today, a lot of Chinese policymakers incorporate indigenous ideas, especially at the local grassroots level, to formulate economic policy at the grassroots level. So there are customized solutions to customized solutions to drive policy. Similarly, in Japan, much of their Japanese economic policy is a derivative of their cultural norms and narratives. So much so that they have research wings, something similar to an IKS, in a lot of their departments, especially the Ministry of Finance, which drives a lot of their economic policy and policy making. So even modern day capitalism, as envisaged by someone like by the Anglo-Saxon world, driven by people like Adam Smith, was a derivative of the Protestant way of ethic of life. The reason why I mention all this is that most of these countries, either the United States or aspiring countries like China and Japan, who want to be a superpower or an established superpower like the United States, intrinsically take their philosophy, take their thinking from their indigenous ideas, from their indigenous cultural norms and narratives, and use that as an inspiration for their progress. I think that's fundamental to this, and I think that's very important as Bharat moves towards Viksit Bharat. That not only do we get an understanding of this, but we also need to use some of these ideas, since it's so intrinsic to our way of existence and our economic choices, and use these ideas from a policy sense to enhance effectiveness of policy. So this leads to some of my key research theme and questions. Like I mentioned, aligning policy making to the Dharmic way of life is an important theme that I try to push through some of my research, especially over the last a decade, because this Dharmic way of life, which I've been talking about, which is our essential cultural way of life, our cultural activities, our economic choices based on these cultural activities, is a product of thousands of years of existence. So if policy making is aligned to that natural way of life, it makes it far more effective. So I used two major research questions. What is the indigenous economic model that Bharat has through our history? Why is it relevant today? The second question is, what is the role of cultural norms and narratives in economic decision making, both at the individual level and the corporate as an extension policy level? This is an important chart which gives you an idea of why our past was illustrious. If you look at this chart this is from Angus Madison's research, the late economist, who studied economic history and produced a GDP and GDP per capita series for about 1,000 years. From 0 CE onwards, if you notice, till about 17th century CE, Bharat was one of the top 2 countries in terms of per capita income and also in terms of GDP, along with China, in alternating positions during this period. So this provides not a definitive perspective, but the trend line is very important. Because the absolute numbers are still, given that it was many years in the past, absolute numbers are still a bit, we should take it with a pinch of salt. But the relative numbers and the relative rankings and trend lines, that Bharat was an area of global prosperity, driving global commerce and driving global activity, is very much seen in this chart. So I think this is an important base or an inspiration for me to study the past of what led to this progress. How did Bharat become? What are the economic frameworks behind this prosperity, and what were the underpinning philosophies behind it? So that led to my research on some of my books. So first, my first book, the previous book which Dr. Balu mentioned on Kautilyanomics for modern times, deals with Kautilya's artha shastra. And I've spent about 4 or 5 years understanding the artha shastra, and I created this framework called Dharmic capitalism. Basically, the underpinning of Kautilya's philosophy in economic philosophy in the artha shastra, in my view, goes through the prism of Dharmic capitalism. I define dharma through 3 components. One is ethics, one is harmony, and another is responsibilities. In terms of outcomes related to these components, ethics, as you see from the presentation, is mapped to clean administration, clean institutions, enforcement of rules, and driver of economic growth and wealth creation. Harmony talks about the outcomes it provides is global outlook, engaging the rest of the world, social welfare and well-being. And then through the prism of responsibilities, I talk about the role of sustainable growth through familial, societal and environmental responsibilities. And these are all outcomes related to Dharmic capitalism. And these outcomes related to Dharmic capitalism are mapped to 3 major pillars of Dharmic capitalism. One is a rule-based yet non-intrusive state. In very simple terms, Kautilya argues for a state which is strict in terms of implementing rule of law and regulations. So if there's a rule of law, if there's a law and people don't follow the particular law, then the punishments are given are quite severe, and they make sure that they follow the punishments are ensured for people, and the rule of law takes its course. But the state does not micromanage. It doesn't, for example, if Dr. Balu and myself are trading, say, products during Kautilya's time, we are open to trading whatever that we wanted to trade with each other. The state would not micromanage in the quantity of products that we are trading, the quality of products, the type of products, and things like that. But it will give an overarching framework and architecture on governance or on rules and regulations to enable this trade between two people and ensure that those rules and regulations are followed to the maximum. So this is what is in very simple terms, a rule-based yet non-intrusive state. Another idea is wealth creation via global outlook, which is another pillar which I mentioned. This is very important to understand. We are often, told that somehow Bharat became open to the rest of the world only post the economic reforms of 1990. While that is true for post-independent India, but much of our history, our ancient history, we've been consistently engaging in commerce and maritime trade with the rest of the world. And most of the thought leaders and kings over the past, including Kautilya himself, promoted the idea of engaging with trade, engaging with the rest of the world in terms of ideas as well as commerce. So wealth creation was not a taboo. Wealth creation was something that was seen as something positive, so much so that Kautilya provided a lot of incentives for people who are importing a lot of goods into the country, a lot of tax incentives as well, and also ensure that the proper environment was set for commerce and wealth creation to happen, so that not only do our products go to the rest of the world, but also ensure that the local market also expands because of this opportunity. So wealth creation via global outlook is another important pillar of Dharmic capitalism. The last pillar is sustainable growth and welfare through the prism of responsibilities. I think this is again a distinct concept which Kautilya had compared to Western philosophers, because much of the Western discourse has been related to the role of rights and less on responsibilities. What Kautilya argues is that while rights is important, the rule of law and the entire legislative process related to rights are important, but the role of responsibilities is also equally, if not more important, because the role of responsibility is intrinsic to this dharmic way of life. And he argues about the importance of familial responsibilities for an individual family, societal responsibilities for a particular community in that particular area where people live, and then environmental responsibilities. The idea of entire, environmental protection was something which Kautilya had explicitly mentioned thousands of years ago in the Artha shastra, and there is enough evidence to suggest that environmental responsibilities is another important component of his worldview. So the third pillar is sustainable growth and welfare. So just briefly, we spoke about the idea of dharma, definition of dharma by ethics, harmony and responsibilities, and then the outcomes related to dharmic capitalism based on this idea of dharma, and then the pillars of the outputs of dharmic capitalism, which is a rule-based yet non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook, and sustainable growth and welfare. So this is broadly what Kautilyanomics deals with. And then for each chapter, I talk about a lot of conventional themes like trade, like inequality, labor contracts, and I venture into each of these ideas in the current context and mention some of Kautilya's ideas that could be relevant today. So that deals with Kautilyanomics for modern times. So this Dharmic capitalism framework is a base for a lot of my research. So now moving to Dharmanomics, which is the current book which Dr. Balu is mentioning about. It is we dealt with Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is 3rd century BCE text, and this is part of a trilogy of books. So the second part of the trilogy is Dharmanomics, which deals with common era kingdoms, the Cholas, the Pallavas, the Pandyas, Kambuja Desa in Cambodia, Vijayanagara Empire, Java, Champa in Vietnam. So combination of common era kingdoms in current Bharat, in southern Bharat, and also Southeast Asian kingdoms, because a lot of the knowledge systems and a lot of the cultural fabric of Bharat went all the way till Southeast Asia and was there significantly over this period, especially in the common era period. So I cover a lot of these kingdoms in Southeast Asia and provide a perspective of Dharmanomics. And in Dharmanomics, there are three again main I would call them pillars of Dharmanomics. One is Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism. We just discussed that, where I see a lot of evidence of Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is present in a lot of these Southeast Asian kingdoms, where there's evidence to suggest there are references to the Arthashastra as an inspiration or in terms of a text. And that is evident in a lot of these Southeast Asian kingdoms. And there are various moderations of this, which they use in their kingdoms and in the Common Era kingdoms as well, in the Cholas and Pallavas. But this serves an important inspiration. So like I mentioned, a rule enforcing a non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook, and sustainable growth and welfare. So this is one component of Dharmanomics. The second important component is what I call the Dharmic ecosystem. I think this is very important because a lot of the temple-based economies, we see, for example, in the southern, if you travel in Tamil Nadu, you will notice that there are thousands of large temples which are still there, which are thriving. And most of the villages across Bharat have one major temple which serves as a very important institution in that decentralized village. And much of our discourse has been on the, rightfully so, has been on the social and the religious aspect of the temple. But the temple serves as a very important economic institution, not just what the temples by itself, but also the ecosystem around it, the tourism that comes because of the temple, the road networks, the infrastructure that's built because of the temple town, the employment it provides for a large section of people. So the temple-based economies played a very important role, not just today, but even thousands of years back. So, for example, in Cambodia, between 6th century CE till about 13th century CE, the temple-based economies were central to their economic structure, not as an add-on, but as central, because Cambodia is more or less landlocked except for the southern part, which is exposed to the sea. So their importance of trade was not as lucrative as other countries. So they use the temple-based economic model significantly, and I illustrate that with a lot of details in my book. But the primary idea is the temple was a centralized, decentralized economic system in Cambodia and in all these places, all these early Common Era kingdoms, where it served as not just a religious institution, but much more than that. And it enabled customized, sustainable solutions as well, so that at the local level, so that it empowers folks at the local level and expands economies of scale at the local level. The last pillar of Dharmanomics is Srini Dharma. Srinis are basically corporate guilds which were there in ancient Bharat for thousands of years again. These guilds played a very important role in financing and in driving global maritime trade. So, for example, the Cholas, who were well known to have traversed the oceans to go to Southeast Asia, to conquer Southeast Asia, Rajendra Chola, the son of Rajaraja Chola. Rajaraja Chola is the king who built the Brihadishwara temple, which is a very famous temple in Tamil Nadu, which is a UNESCO recognized temple. And his son, Rajendra Chola, who had conquered many kingdoms both in Bharat and outside, he went all the way to Southeast Asia to establish some of these, or at least engage in conquering some of these places. But one of the main reasons why he went was because of a guild called Ainnoruvar. In Tamil, it's called 500. This was a corporate guild which was financing a lot of the Cholas, and they had a lot of offices in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Thailand, in Indonesia, for example. They were like multinational corporations of today, a combination of multinational corporations as well as, say, regulatory bodies like CII and things like that, a combination of both. They were highly independent from the state, and they conquered. So they were financing the Cholas, and they were trading via the Straits of Malacca to China from Bharat and from Middle East as well. So one of the kingdoms in Indonesia tried to stifle the trade of these guilds, and that's why the Cholas went and fought with the Srivijaya kingdom, which is ruling Indonesia, along with the Cambodians, to enable commerce and to ensure that these guilds could function without any difficulty. Why I'm giving this example is to provide you two perspectives. One, the idea of having sort of international engagement, international commerce was the norm thousands of years back. So much so that it was driving a lot of the common people were engaging in part of these guilds, and they were very egalitarian. They had members of people across communities, across castes, and also even people from different nationalities who were part of these guilds. And they were driving a lot of this commerce. And the politicians and the political class were merely following them in their pursuit of trade and commerce. So the idea of wealth creation was very inbuilt, and the Srinis played a very important role in having this continuity. Please remember, we're talking about thousands of years back, despite many rulers and many people who have who exchange kingdoms during this period of time. But yet the economic instruments driven by this concept of dharma was not just sustainable, but it was there for many thousands of years, playing a very important role in driving not just commerce in Bharat, but as an extension, driving global commerce as well. So briefly on the temple-based economies, like I mentioned, the temple served as a multi-dimensional institution. There are four main, pillars of it. One is they were major labor aggregators. They provided a lot of employment for people because of the fact that the temple owned large sections of land. They provided employment for a lot of the communities. A lot of the affiliated activities related to temple construction and the communities around were providing employment. The temples were providing employment as well. Second, they served as banks and financial institutions. It's important to understand why a large section of major temples, whether it's Puri in Jagannath, whether it is Somnath, the temple in Somnath, whether it's the Thiruvananthapuram temple, the Padmanabha Swami temple, most of them are within an hour's drive from the coastline. It's because most of the temples serve as banks and financial institutions. They were providing financing for a lot of these guilds, which I mentioned, and at nominal rates. And those interest payments that were made to them were used for further investments around the temple area or around the village and around the communities, local communities. They also served as venture capital funds. They provided local incentives for entrepreneurs at the local level and ensured that they were provided financing. Lastly, they were major redistributive agents, which means, in very simple terms, there is a lot of evidence in the Tirumala temple plates, the Tirupati temple, where it talks about how the Vijayanagar Empire had ensured that the temple provided a lot of was a redistributive instrument, in a sense that the local rich folks in a particular area put money into an endowment which was governing the temple, and the temple provided free food 3 times a day for anyone who would come to the temple, thereby ensuring that people who were below a poverty line had continuous food through an endowment which was triggered by the rich in that particular area. So in this way, it sort of ensured that the redistributive sort of philosophy was taken care, and some wealth transfer was happening from the rich to the poor through the instrument of a temple. Similarly, there's a lot of comparisons with Srinis in the modern day cooperation. For example, this table illustrates how the Srinis, in terms of their the governance structures, they had democratically elected leaders in the Srinis. In terms of the egalitarianism, they had people across castes, across creed, across nationalities. They had voting regulations. They had transparency. They also had formation and exit of Srinis also to be quite easily done. And they had an entire governance structure, which was not just democratic, but it was independent, and it also ensured that rights and responsibilities were also taken care. So, in very simple terms, its similarities to a modern day corporation is quite stark, and that is illustrated by this table. Another principle again is from the Kautilya's Arthashastra is avoiding Matsya Nyaya, which is basically the big fish eating the small fish, basically ensuring that through the implementation of rule of law and order, everyone is given equal opportunity, equal rights and responsibilities, especially in the rule of implementation of rule of law and order. And there is no big entity which is swallowing the smaller person. So this is one theme that you see again across the Arthashastra. Similarly, for rule of law and enforcement of contracts, the role of kingship, property laws and enforcement, labor contracts and enforcement. This is again, these are all things that you see in our ancient text and references to them. I'll just give one small example where Kautilya argues that for daily wage laborers, for example, when you go to a construction site in Delhi or in any major city in Bharat, you walk into it, most of the daily wage laborers don't have a contractual arrangement. Almost 2000 plus years ago, Kautilya argued that daily wage laborers have to have a contractual arrangement so that there is an understanding with the employer on how much they need to work, what are the timings of work, and what are the contours of what needs to be done, so that they have some agency, some level of empowerment, so that the employer does not take undue advantage of the employee. So these type of contractual arrangements, enforcement of this, were all evident in the Arthashastra as well. So what are some of the examples of the present and the past? As I wrap up this discussion, I will try to be brief with this. Of course, the Mahakumbh Mela, I think all of you have been privy to how such a big, massive event it is, with 400 million people arriving at the Kumbh Mela in a space of 45 days. But this is a classic example of Dharmanomics in action. There are four major entities which when you look through an economic lens, firstly, it is a decentralized economic boom with a highly inelastic demand. So what do I mean in this jargon? Basically, irrespective, when I mean highly inelastic demand, I'm saying that irrespective of what the macro environment is irrespective of what the RBI's interest rates are, irrespective of what inflation is, you would still get 400 million people who come and converge at one particular place in Prayagraj for the next Mahakumbh or for all the Mahakumbhs, before. So what I'm trying to say is, irrespective of all these things, all these people who will exhibit their way of life and attend a huge cultural conclave such as this. And of course, this results in a lot of direct economies of scale. So for example, the estimates for the revenue generated is about 2.5 lakh crores. And just to give you some context, the GDP of Uttar Pradesh in the last year, 2023-2024, was 25.8 lakh crores. So by these estimates, if 10% of GDP there's a contribution in some form or the other, even if you take a lower estimate between 5 to 10%, that's a huge number. So it provides a lot of direct economies of scale, because all these people who come to these places, they need to have food, they need to have tourism, some place to stay, they need to have transportation, they need to, they will probably go to different places after coming to Prayagraj. And a lot of these indirect economies of scale is done. And a lot of the infrastructure for all this is developed. And this infrastructure remains in this place after the Kumbh as well. So there is a lot of indirect economies of scale, which happens because of this. And then an important point is, it provides a time-bound policy response for greater policy effectiveness. So the bureaucrats, for example, are provided a gap of, within 45 days, all this infrastructure needs to be set up. To ensure that within 45 days, so many people are coming. So it has to, there's a time-bound feature of this, so that people have to ready for the Mahakumbh, ready the entire infrastructure for this time-bound engagement. So this ensures that policy making is far more effective, and also ensures that because of the global limelight, the national limelight on this, that a lot of this infrastructure is accelerated, a lot of progress is made on policy in an event such as this. So this is a very classic example of what I would call Dharmanomics in action. Similarly, successful examples that I've seen is the Swachh Bharat scheme, which is a very important and has been a very successful scheme of the Honorable Prime Minister. I see that the success of the Swachh Bharat scheme, especially in a lot of the rural areas, is because it's a perfect example of how policy is aligned to the way of life. There's always this tendency to be clean in our houses. It's called Saucham, which is a definition of Dharma. And Prime Minister, given his experience in dealing with poverty at a personal level, and I think the entire establishment was made a conscious effort to reach out to this Saucham angle of people and make it their responsibility to take care of their environment just outside their houses. So much so that when you go to most of the rural areas, even in places such as Tamil Nadu, for example, most of the streets are all fairly clean nowadays. With the Swachhata Clinic, it's become sort of an autopilot. Except for the main bazaar street, most of the other streets are quite clean and quite, environmentally friendly. And the entire Swachhata movement has created this autopilot among people because it's taken their normal way of life and used that and expanded policy effectiveness so much so that it's far more effective compared to before. Similarly, the RBI's sovereign gold scheme is another example where the entire scheme was tweaked to ensure that women who deposited their gold for this scheme got the same gold pack because gold was seen as a cultural asset. In the West, it's seen as a non-productive asset. In India, it's seen as a cultural asset. So the tweaks were made to be sensitive towards this cultural aspect of Indian women, and that tweak ensured it's successful. Similarly, in UP government's One Product, One Village is another very interesting but successful scheme that you see that which caters to local customized needs and caters to the Dharmic way of life, because that determines a lot of these products that are developed in that local area, and it's sensitive towards that. And of course, the smart city expansion and a plan to improve tier 2, tier 3 cities is another good step in the decentralized economic governance setup. Way forward, I see a couple of things. I mean, especially for this audience who are policymakers and civil servants and people in government, I would say, first, conscious alignment of policymaking towards this Dharmic way of life and its processes could lead to much more efficient policy outcomes. Most people at the ground level intrinsically are aware of this. They do it in their, subconsciously. But I think there has to be a conscious policy incentive towards this, so that for people who are not aware on the ground, there's greater awareness created. Because what it ensures is that when it's aligned to the natural way of life, it becomes a natural responsibility for individuals to do it, and it enhances effectiveness of policy, right? The second point is cognizant of local customized needs and building economies of scale around it. I think the decentralized economic structure is the way forward, building local economies of scale, expanding these tier 2, tier 3 cities through these decentralized models. I mean, through these instruments, such as an example is the temple-based economies, which I mentioned, which could expand the economies of scale in that particular area and ensure commerce is taken care of. Because the transportation to a lot of these tier 2, tier 3 towns have been developed through a variety of infrastructure developments. So it's really a question of having targeted enhancements of these local economies of scale and driving this through the decentralized economic model. And lastly, there's a greater need for customized local solutions while incorporating global ideas and best practices. I think this really suits well with the Atmanirbharta philosophy of the Honorable Prime Minister, and because a country as complex as Bharat, as diverse as Bharat, cannot be defined by a single philosophy or single model. It has to be something that we have to be intrinsically developed. It has to ideate, and it has to align to the way of life, which has been there for thousands of years. And it has to be localized at a localized level, customized to a lot of the local needs, which are there because of our diverse, because of our diversity and our diverse cultural norms and narratives. So in that sense, I think it's important we incorporate global ideas, best practices, but it's equally important that we are cognizant of these, the impact of this cultural way of life in economic decision making. Because remember, as we move towards Viksit Bharat, this entire informal structure, which is again driven by a lot of these cultural norms and narratives, and the entire sort of rural economy, which is also driven by this, and of course, some part of the urban economy as well, in terms of our economic choices, are all underpinned by this Dharmic way of life. So if we are to move towards Viksit Bharat, this way of life also needs to be optimized to the maximum, so that we use this as a good catalyst for us and provide indigenous solutions, which are not only addressing some of the modern problems such as climate change, sustainability, and all these things, but it would ensure that we provide leadership to the rest of the world as we move towards a rising superpower. So with this, I'll just wrap the presentation. Lastly, I just want to provide some perspective. This is for those enthusiasts who are interested in traveling, this is in Cambodia, on top of a hill in a place called Cabal, Spain, where you see the three images. The first image is that of Lord Brahma. The second is of Lord Ranganatha, and the third image is where you have thousands of Shivlingas, over which a river flows through. The idea is really the integration of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and this river is the source of water to Cambodia as well. And this was created in, again, early CE period by one of the Hindu kings in Cambodia. And I think with this, sort of intriguing and captivating image, I wrap my presentation. And thank you once again for providing me this opportunity. And of course, to the Prime Minister's office and the Honorable Prime Minister for the encouragement and motivation for such research as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sriram, for that. It was a very, very interesting and eye-opening presentation. Sometimes what happens is when we think of looking at the civilizational depth and breadth of Indian knowledge, there's always two ways in which people generally look at it. One is the skeptical way of being dismissive about it, or the other way of just being emotionally saying it's all perfect. But you could blend rationale and the deep understanding of what is there in India and how do we contextualize it for today's future. I especially love the way you spoke about how ethics, harmony, and responsibilities come together, and the manifestation of it, whether it's wealth creation, the global outlook, or sustainability of the environmental stewardship driven by Kartavya, was a wonderful basis. As you'll be aware, one of the ways we look at the Karmayogi competency framework, the foundation comes from the call of Panch Pran, which the Honorable Prime Minister gave, in which Kartavya is a very significant part of it. And therefore, we draw inspiration from that and say, what are the competencies that can enable a person to think of responsibilities? And so all this seamlessly comes together. Now, we have had a lot of questions that's come up. I know we only have the 15 minutes left for us to address them. So I'll try to ask you in the context of what you explained, the indigenous economic models of Bharat and the way you brought about it in such fine way. We're really looking forward to the third part of your series of books, which will be what you explain. Now, we do know that cultural norms and narratives are very important for policymakers. And that's the reason why our Karmayogi competency framework is also driven by that thinking and model. And you gave a lot of examples, and the Mahakumbh was a brilliant example, how it integrates a very intense localized economy, but which would be completely inelastic in that sense, but at the same time generates nearly 5 to 10%. Like you said, the numbers might be either the lower side or the higher side, doesn't matter, but a substantial part of the state's GSDP itself. But in this context, could you also suggest some more examples of how does economics and beyond, because economics is something which touches lives in so many different ways, and in the context of how today the importance that that is placed in the civilizational appreciation of investing on human and social capital, and that leading to economic growth, and the narrative of how policy making was aligned to this way of dharmic thinking, that you invest on people, you invest on what you also explained, the guild that existed. It's an enormous expression of social capital. And how is it relevant in today's times as we are marching towards Vikasit Bharat and we're talking about India becoming a Vishwa Guru, a global model? So I'm going to combine two questions that we have got into this. One is how pertinent and relevant would this be in the current economic growth narrative of India, where it's not just economic growth, it's situated in building human and social capital. The second part of the question is, are there lessons for the world from India? And as the rest of the world's cultural examples feeding into their economic growth story, the tragedy of our times is sometimes we think good practice will be applicable in our context also and try to imitate it, but it might have worked for them. And what are those kind of examples work for some of those countries? In your own research, you would have possibly seen this around the world, and having worked in multilateral institutions, you're privy to that kind of a comparative analysis. I would like to listen to you on that.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting question. So on the first question, right, I'll try to illustrate with an example, very contextual example, right? So we have been seeing how DeepSeek has really shaken the AI world in the last couple of days, right? How is it that, a bunch of Chinese researchers sitting in China, who don't have as much resources as say the West, Sam Altmans of the world, are able to produce a path-breaking research entity, right? I think that's a very, very important question, right? In my view, if you really look at the Chinese trajectory of, how they build their economic structures, economic models, though they're a communist state, there is a lot of sort of decentralized governance, decentralized, systems, which enable people at the ground level to use a lot of local techniques, local customized solutions, to inspire researchers such as this to drive outcomes. I think, as a country who's aspirational, who's becoming a developed superpower, these elements are very important, because see, the Western way of their progress and prosperity was through a Western Protestant lens, in the sense that was their functioning base. Whereas for a lot of the Asian societies, whether it's the Japanese, whether it's the Chinese, the Koreans, most of them have a lot of these indigenous ideas which drive the impetus for a lot of their governance structures, which produces outcomes like DeepSeek, right? The important fact here within DeepSeek is, besides all the technical know-how, technical investment, and all these things, there is an intrinsic, inspirational, indigenous push, which drives a lot of the commerce, a lot of the functioning that happens in that country, right? So similarly, I think it's very important to understand that in today's times, whether it's today or thousands of years back, the reason why I ended up doing a lot of this research is I saw a lot of confluence between what we have today compared to thousands of years back. What this dharmic way of life that I'm talking about, the cultural choices that we make today, has not changed much at all over thousands of years. As individuals, especially in economics, because eventually as individuals, we have to make economic choices. So today I'm purchasing a laptop, for example, right? 1,000 years back, I might purchase a boat, or I might purchase a perfume from some trader. But eventually, as an individual, I have to make an economic choice, right? So that choice is determined by, say, X, Y, Z factors, right? Say it's determined by 2, 3 factors, right? Those 2, 3 factors don't really change much, because my way of life is determining that economic choice, right? So if I'm able to, if I need to understand how people make economic choices today, the factors and the things that they take into account, you need to have a robust understanding of this dharmic way of life from an academic and policy sense. I think that is the impetus, because as you're moving towards Viksit Bharat, we are at 6 to 7% or 7 to 8% GDP, right? If you want to move to, say, 9 to 10% GDP, you have to move from the status quo, which means you have to take it to another level where a lot of these small economies of scale are scaled up, to the point where this improves the overall, pursuit of economic growth as well. And that can be done only when it is, in my view, it can be done only when it's aligned to this way of life, because this way of life provides a lot of economic opportunity, highly inelastic demand, highly decentralized, right? Imagine all the tier 2, tier 3 cities that we have, right? And all of them could be mapped to these local economies of scale and expanded significantly. Like today, for example, you could take a flight from Srirangam to Delhi, directly because of connectivity, right? So you can sit in Srirangam, which is a temple town, right? Expanding all the economies of scale in the temple town, and then connect to a faraway city like Delhi because of our connectivity. So it really provides us opportunity to move away from this urban-centric approach and then move to, because all our urban cities have really expanded to the, for example, in Chennai, if you're from Chennai, you know that Chennai has now moved all the way to Kanchipuram and all the way to Mahabalipuram, right? So urbanization is important, but it has its own limitations. I think the eventual solution is decentralized tier 2, tier 3 sort of smart city model, but inspired by local anecdotes, indigenous ideas, because those are the things that are going to drive and provide you indigenous solutions like DeepSeek. You would rather want to be, produce optimized individual solution within our constraints. That inspiration is the main driver. So I think as we move towards Viksit Bharat, that's a very important point. On the second point of how our ideas resonate with the rest of the world, I'll give you another example, right? So I've been, as you mentioned, at the international space for some time. So around, say, if when International Yoga Day started around 2014-15, people would recognize what yoga is, right, in all these places, but they would still be like, okay, fine. But today, in 2025, during International Yoga Day, there's not a single global leader or any global icon who's either not aware of what a yoga day is or is not doing yoga on a yoga mat, right, in many of these places, right? So that is the difference between what we are seeing in terms of a global presence. I think this is very, very important because a lot of our ideas, a lot of indigenous ideas address a lot of global issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's sustainability, whether it's issues related to, say, mental health or your own individual health or collective health of a nation, of the idea of, the entire UPI system, the digital public infrastructure, right? All what I'm trying to say is, what I'm trying to highlight here is, we are seen now as an aspirational superpower, right? We are not. We have moved from 50 years back. We are seen as a snake charming, very reductionist society. Now we are seen as an aspirational superpower with strong leadership, whose ideas not just resonate, but are seen as inspirational for the rest of the world to deal with a lot of the issues that the world is facing. So the world is looking at India and trying to understand India because it sees Bharat as a global leader of sorts, or an aspiring leader. So that makes a big difference, because not only are our ideas intrinsically addressing a lot of these global issues, the fact that we are a rising superpower also gives a lot of credence at the political and the socio-economic level for people to look up these ideas in a much more serious way. And I think that is happening. So what I'm trying to highlight here is, not only is this important for us to grow and move towards Viksit Bharat, I think it's also important for us in our path towards Viksit Bharat to a lot of these ideas which will benefit the world. Similarly, similar to what, say, thousands of years back the Srinis were doing, for example, right? The Srinis were not just promoting and highlighting international trade for Bharat. They were taking, because much of global trade was in Asia, and they were drivers of that global trade and global commerce. So I think there's a lot of potential, and this is how I am seeing practically how some of these things are evolving in a positive sense.
But drawing from your answer and from your earlier presentation about the non-inclusiveness of the state, what Kautilya also spoke about, today it's sort of a challenge. In one sense, there's an ongoing debate about state control of temples, which essentially in extension means state control of temple-driven economies. At the same time, on the other hand, one can also argue and say Mahakumbh is also extremely well organized. You cannot even imagine, like you said, between 400 to 500 million people congregating over a 45-day period. And that's because of the protection of the state and the complete organizational capability of the state. So it's a delicate balance in a sense, but alignment of a temple economy to a larger construct macro model, can it really be done without any state participation? Or do you feel that, I know it's a contentious debate, but state control is partially needed, essentially not needed, or essentially needed? What would be your views in alignment to the Dharmanomics that you talk about?
See, this is again another effort that I try to draw a distinction to, right? One is this entire debate on state versus private entity for the temple, right? The temple as an institution, which means once you enter into a temple, either the prasadam or the archana that you give, whatever that's inside the temple, right? In terms of governance of the temple, that's a revenue that the temple generates, right? But the economies of scale around the temple ecosystem is a different ball game altogether, right? That is what I am sort of focusing, because that's a less contentious issue, right? The economies of scale around the temple ecosystem is something which we can liberate and have a sort of a 1990 type of reforms and all those entities, because they are away from the political issue with the state control of the temple. See, eventually the political issue related to the state sort of entity or the local leaders taking control of the temple is a political sort of issue, right? That, I think, through the processes eventually there will be an outcome, right, which will enable that, right? And I think from a theoretical standpoint or from a opinion standpoint, my personal view is, of course, religious institutions should belong to the community, right? That is how I feel from a practical and probably from a Hindu's mind frame. But given the realities of governance and the challenges of it and the structures of it, that is a political issue. What I am trying to leverage is that there is an ecosystem that the temple creates around the community, around the village level, and around the tier 2, tier 3 city level. Why don't we expand those economies of scale? Why don't we liberate all of them, and get the market more in, get the state as a regulatory entity in those spheres, which is less politically contentious, right? It can be far more targeted. It can be far more, done in a this way as this thing unfolds, as the process unfolds. And of course, there are advantages to, what you mentioned when the state controls. But again, there is a distinction, right? See, the Mahakumbh is an example. It's not a temple per se event. It is a Dharmic event, part of the Dharmic ecosystem, but it is going to a particular place, and where a lot of people congregate in that particular place and take snan and have the divine experience and move away, right? But the entire governance structure, like you mentioned, has been possible because of the state, right? In terms of the policing and in terms of the entire support system and all this, right? I think that there's a difference between that and, say, in a temple per se, where there are certain agamas, there are certain functioning of the temple, and the role of the state in that prism, right? And the issues emanating from it. So I think even within this Dharmic ecosystem, there are various layers to it, and there are various layers to the governance structures around it. And I think as a principle in general, the role of the state, at least from what Kautilya and a lot of the ancient Bharat, folks have used in my research, and also what I think from an international perspective is also best practices, is that you would want the state to pay a sort of an oversight of a view in terms of setting the mechanisms right, setting the rules and regulations right, ensuring that justice and all that is done, but not to micromanage the activities that we do. So essentially, we would want a rule enforcing but non-intrusive state. That rule enforcing includes administration, includes governance, includes, for example, if you have a regulatory body which oversees a lot of these temples, okay, of which the state is an important participant, right, to ensure that all these things takes place, that could be a solution to deal with some of these issues. But I think the underlying principle, see, and another point that I want to add to all of your listeners is that I'm not trying to say that the past is glorious and everything in the past is great. That's not the point here, right? The point here is there was a period of time in this country where we were really prosperous. We were one of the top countries in the world. There was an economic philosophy behind it. And guess what? That economic philosophy was highly intrinsic to this Dharmic way of life, highly intertwined, highly integrated, right? And there are a lot of lessons from the past that we can use today. There are some things which we need to avoid and move on, but there are quite a few things which we can use today, because the same Dharmic way of life is only there even today, which is emanating itself and expressing itself in various forms. So those ideas, first principles, I think is very important. We pick the first principles and devise policy using these first principles, given our practical constraints today. I think that's the sort of approach that one needs to take.
Wonderful, Sriram. I think we can keep talking, because this is a topic which is of great interest to all of us and a lot of lessons to be learned. And I know we run out of time, but I really want to thank you for bringing it so well, stitching it all together and explaining how we can't be emotional about these things. We got to ensure that draw up the paradigm, the principles that we can take, the first principles that are applicable in the cultural context of today, also in the the appropriateness of it, the relevance of it, and then marry it with the current needs. Like marrying technology with the Dharmic way of life is a completely new way of thinking, because maybe this extent and depth of technology wasn't available at that point of time. So we need to use the principles rather than just the products. But it's wonderful talking to you, and a great hour of learning so much about this. I'm sure for all the policymakers who are tuned on to this webinar, there'll be a lot of lessons they can start doing. More importantly, it is not just the economic way of thinking, but a Dharmic appreciation of the civilizational wisdom this nation has got. In different kinds of ways we look at policy making, and connecting it all together to make sure that it fits the cultural DNA of a wonderful nation like us. I know India is a very complex democracy, It's got a lot of legacy institutions intertwined with the colonial past that we have. We need to come out of a lot of that. At the same time, we need to build on some of our own traditional legacy institutions. And this talk would be a sort of a harbinger for us to understand how to bring about this change. So thank you again. And it was wonderful conversation with you. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.